Elliot Sinclair leaned back in his ergonomic chair, his gaze locked onto the glowing screen of his computer. The polished mahogany desk reflected the dim light of his office, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. The clock in the corner of his monitor mocked him, 11:37 p.m. Another late night at Sinclair and Vaughn, another project demanding his full attention. At 42, Elliot had built an empire from the ground up. Horizon Tower was set to be his magnum opus, an eco-friendly skyscraper that would revolutionize urban sustainability. Investors were lining up, the board was ecstatic, and everything seemed to be aligning perfectly. Until tonight. His phone vibrated against the smooth wood, buzzing twice before sliding slightly toward the edge. He reached for it, expecting a message from his business partner Tristan Hale or perhaps a reminder about tomorrow's board meeting. Instead, the name on the screen made his brow furrow. Lena Sinclair. His wife was supposed to be in San Francisco, attending a sustainability conference. They had spoken earlier in the evening, exchanging the usual pleasantries. So why was she calling now? Elliot swiped to answer, but before he could say a word, he realized something was wrong. The call had connected on its own. A muffled clinking of glasses. A low, rich chuckle. Laughter, her laughter, but it wasn't the kind he was used to hearing. Then a man's voice. Smooth, confident, and too familiar. Another round, on Sinclair and Vaughn's tab. That clueless fool is financing our little venture without even knowing it. Elliot's blood ran ice cold. His grip tightened around the phone as his stomach twisted. Lena's voice followed, light and teasing. Elliot's always been blind to anything beyond his precious buildings. He practically blends into the walls he designs. The man laughed, a deep, knowing chuckle. Graham Holloway. The name alone sent a rush of adrenaline through Elliot's veins. CEO of Holloway Developments. His biggest rival. The man who had been trying to steal projects from under him for years. Elliot clenched his jaw so tightly it ached. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the desk, willing himself to stay silent, to keep listening. You don't have to worry about him, Lena, Graham continued, amusement dripping from his tone. By the time he realizes what's happening, Sinclair and Vaughn will be a footnote in history. Horizon Tower will be ours. A soft clink, likely their glasses toasting to his downfall. Then silence. The call had ended. Elliot sat in the darkness of his office, staring at the phone as if it had turned into something unrecognizable. His wife. His rival. His life's work, betrayed in a single conversation. His world had just imploded. For the next few days, Elliot played the role of an ignorant husband, though every word, every glance from Lena felt like a carefully crafted deception. She returned from San Francisco with the same easy grace, kissing his cheek, asking about his projects as if she hadn't been conspiring against him. He smiled. He responded. He played along. But inside, he was unraveling the web. During the day, he maintained his usual schedule, leading meetings, approving designs, preparing for the final investment round for Horizon Tower. But at night, when the office emptied and the city outside dimmed, Elliot hunted for answers. He started with financial records. The discrepancies were subtle, tiny leaks in corporate accounts, money shifting into shell companies with vague descriptions. Lena had been draining funds for months. Then came communications logs. Elliot wasn't a hacker, but he knew people. People who could dig into deleted messages, track hidden accounts, unearth digital footprints left by the careless and arrogant. What he found made his stomach churn. Late-night calls. Secret meetings. Wire transfers linked directly to Holloway Developments. But the final nail in the coffin? Lena had access to Sinclair and Vaughn's confidential blueprints. She had stolen Horizon Tower's designs, and she had given them to Graham Holloway. The following morning, Elliot made a call of his own. By noon, he sat in a dimly lit coffee shop across from Celeste Monroe, a private investigator with a reputation for handling corporate espionage. She was sharp-eyed, dressed in an unassuming black blazer, her expression unreadable as she stirred a spoon through her coffee. I usually deal with corporate fraud, not scorned husbands, she mused, studying him. Elliot's jaw flexed. This isn't about a failed marriage. This is about my company. He slid a folder across the table. Lena and Graham Holloway have been siphoning confidential data. I need to know everything, who else is involved, how long this has been going on, and what their endgame is. Celeste flipped through the documents, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp calculation. This is bigger than just stealing some blueprints. If Holloway's behind this, he's playing for keeps. Elliot leaned forward. Then let's make sure he loses. She smirked. I like your style, Sinclair. Consider me on board. That night, Elliot returned home to find Lena waiting for him in the kitchen, a glass of wine in hand, a soft smile curving her lips. Long day? She asked, swirling the red liquid. He nodded, forcing a tired sigh. Exhausting. We're close to finalizing Horizon Tower. Just a few more weeks. Lena's fingers tightened subtly around the stem of her glass. He saw it. That's great, babe. Her voice was light, but there was an edge to it. She was fishing, trying to see if he suspected anything. Elliot stepped closer, cupping her cheek. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Lena's smile flickered, just for a second, before she leaned into his touch. Of course, love. We're a team. His stomach twisted at the lie. He pressed a slow kiss to her forehead, lingering just long enough for her to feel the warmth, the trust he once had in her. She had no idea he was already plotting her downfall. And soon, she would watch everything she had worked for burn to the ground. The house had never felt this empty before. Elliot sat behind the wheel, staring at the dimly lit windows, his fingers drumming against the leather steering wheel. Inside, Lena was probably curled up on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand, scrolling through her phone, maybe texting Graham Holloway, maybe laughing. The thought sent a sharp ache through his ribs. The house was dark except for the faint glow of a lamp in the living room window. Lena was home, probably curled up with a glass of wine, maybe scrolling through her phone, texting Graham Holloway. Elliot exhaled, tilting his head back against the seat. He felt like a fool. For years, he had believed in them, in their marriage, in the quiet moments that made up a life together. Mornings when he'd kiss her forehead before heading to work. Evenings when they'd sit on the couch, her feet tucked under his legs as they watched some show she loved, and he barely followed. He had thought those things meant something. But now? Now, he realized those moments had been his alone. Lena had already checked out of their marriage long before he had even noticed. The pain came in waves. Not anger, grief. The kind of grief that settled in your chest and refused to leave. Because it wasn't just the betrayal. It was the lie of it all. He had built his life around her, built his future with her in mind. And the whole time, she had been building an escape plan. Elliot closed his eyes for a long moment before finally forcing himself to move. He got out of the car, adjusting his expression, making sure the mask was back in place. By the time he stepped through the front door, he was the same Elliot she had always known. Or at least, the one she thought she knew. Lena was exactly where he expected her to be, curled up on the couch, a half-finished glass of red wine in her hand, wearing one of those loose sweaters she loved. She looked up and smiled. Hey, you're home early. Elliot forced a chuckle, dropping his keys on the counter. Yeah, thought I'd surprise you. She tilted her head, studying him for a second too long. For a moment, he almost thought she could see through him. That she knew. Then she patted the couch beside her. Come sit with me. Elliot hesitated. How many nights had he come home exhausted, only for her to be too busy to sit with him? How many times had she told him she was tired, that she had a long day, that she just wanted to be alone? And now, suddenly, she wanted to be with him? He sat down beside her, but he didn't touch her. Didn't pull her into him the way he used to. Lena sipped her wine, her gaze flickering to his. You've been quiet lately. Elliot smiled. Just work? She nodded, taking another sip. You know you can talk to me, right? A bitter laugh almost escaped him, but he swallowed it down. Talk to her? About what? How it felt to hear her call him a fool. How it felt to know she had been sleeping with another man and using his money to do it. Instead, he turned to her, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. He let his fingers linger against her cheek just long enough to make her believe the moment was real. I know, he murmured. Lena softened, leaning into his touch. She had no idea. And that was the moment Elliot realized something. He had spent the past few days drowning in betrayal, in anger, in heartbreak. But now? Now, he felt something else entirely. Calm. Because he wasn't the one who had lost anything. She was. Lena had traded something real for a cheap, temporary thrill. She had thrown away a man who had given her everything for a man who would discard her the second she was no longer useful. And she didn't even know it yet. Elliot let his fingers trail down her arm before he pulled away and stood. I'm exhausted, he said. I think I'll head to bed. Lena looked a little surprised, but she nodded. I'll be up soon. Elliot turned without another word, heading upstairs. And as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he felt nothing but a quiet, unshakable certainty. He wasn't going to lose. Not to her. Not to Holloway. Not to anyone. The next morning, Elliot arrived at his office earlier than usual. Tristan Hale was already there, waiting. Elliot set his briefcase down. I need you to pull everything we have on Holloway Developments. Tristan arched an eyebrow. That bad? Elliot met his gaze. Worse. Tristan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. All right. I'll dig. But Elliot. Elliot looked up. Tristan's expression softened just slightly. You okay? Elliot didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, he didn't know. He wasn't sure if any of this would ever be okay again. But he wasn't about to say that. Instead, he gave Tristan a small, practiced smirk. I'm fine. Tristan studied him for a second before nodding. All right. Then let's ruin them. By lunchtime, Elliot was sitting across from Celeste Monroe, his private investigator, in a quiet downtown cafe. She was flipping through the files he had given her, her dark eyes narrowing slightly. Well, she finally said, this is messy. Elliot leaned forward. How bad? Celeste smirked. For them? Very. She pushed a file toward him. Lena's been moving money through offshore accounts. But here's the real kicker. So has Holloway. Elliot frowned. What do you mean? Celeste leaned back in her chair, looking amused. He's not just using your money, Sinclair. He's skimming off his own company. He's been laundering funds through dummy corporations, covering up massive losses. If this gets out. Elliot understood instantly. If Graham Holloway was stealing from his own investors, then it wasn't just corporate espionage anymore. It was fraud. And now? Now, Elliot had everything he needed. That evening, Elliot arrived home to find Lena in the kitchen, humming softly as she cooked. The scent of rosemary and garlic filled the air, the kind of comforting smell that made it almost easy to forget what she had done. Almost. She looked up with a small smile. I made dinner. Elliot returned the smile easily, stepping toward her. He slid an arm around her waist, leaning in just close enough to whisper. You have no idea what's coming, do you? Lena froze, her breath hitching just slightly. Elliot kissed her cheek, then pulled away like nothing had happened. He sat at the table, picking up his fork, watching as she slowly turned back to the stove. For the first time since this had all begun, Lena looked nervous. And Elliot? He felt nothing at all. You sure you want to do this? Tristan Hale's voice crackled through the speaker, low and serious. Elliot tapped his fingers against the dashboard, staring at the house in front of him. It's not about what I want, Elliot murmured. It's about what needs to happen. A heavy silence hung between them. Then Tristan sighed. All right. Just don't let this destroy you too. The house was dark except for the glow from the kitchen window. He could see Lena's silhouette moving inside, graceful, effortless, like nothing had changed. But everything had. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. Why couldn't he just walk inside? It should be easy. He had done it 1,000 times. But tonight, the house felt like a stranger's. The walls no longer held warmth. The front door no longer felt like an invitation home. Because home was built on trust. And Lena had burned it down. Elliot exhaled shakily, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. A painful truth settled in his chest, heavier than anything he had ever carried. He still loved her. And he hated himself for it. After everything she had done, after the lies, the betrayal, the way she had laughed at him with Graham, why did part of him still ache for the woman he had once known? He had spent years building a life with her. Years believing in the quiet moments, in the shared glances, in the way she fit into his world as if she had always belonged there. Had it all been a lie? Had she ever truly loved him? Or had he just been convenient? The thought nearly shattered him. He closed his eyes, trying to push it away, trying to swallow the lump in his throat. But no matter how much he wanted to be cold, to shut off the pain, it refused to leave. Because love doesn't vanish overnight. Betrayal doesn't erase the years before it. And that was the cruelest part. The memories weren't stained. They were still beautiful, still whole. But now they hurt. Elliot finally forced himself to move, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened the car door. The cool night air hit him, grounding him for a moment. Then he stepped inside. Lena turned as he entered, her smile soft, familiar. Hey, love. His heart clenched. She had always called him that. Even when she had been lying. Even when she had been betraying him. Elliot forced a small smile, shrugging off his coat. Hey. She leaned against the counter, watching him. Long day? He nodded. Yeah. She stepped closer, reaching for his tie like she had done 100 times before. You should take a break. We should take a break. Her fingers lingered against his chest, and for a second, just a second, he let himself pretend. Pretend that things were still the same. Pretend that he could pull her into his arms and believe it meant something. Pretend that she was still his. But then he remembered the phone call. Graham's voice. Her laughter. The way she had spoken about him like he was nothing. Elliot gently pulled away, stepping back. Maybe soon. She tilted her head, studying him. You're different lately. He forced a smirk. Work stress. Lena ran a finger along the rim of her wine glass. You sure that's all? She was testing him, checking if he knew. Elliot met her gaze, steady, unreadable. What else would it be? Lena searched his face, then smiled. Nothing. Just checking. He swallowed against the bitterness rising in his throat. God, she was good at this. Too good. But he had been better. For years, he had let himself believe her lies. Now, it was her turn to believe his. Later that night, Elliot sat on the edge of their bed, watching as Lena slept beside him. She looked peaceful, like someone who had nothing to hide. His chest ached. How many nights had he watched her like this? How many times had he reached for her in his sleep, trusting that she would be there? He wanted to hate her. He wanted to erase every soft moment, every whispered, I love you, every memory that made it harder to breathe. But instead, he felt something worse. He felt loss. Because this was the end. Not just of their marriage. Not just of the life they had built. But of the version of himself who had loved her without question. That Elliot was gone. And whoever he was now, whoever he was becoming, he wasn't sure he liked him. His phone vibrated on the nightstand. A message from Tristan. It's done. We're ready. Elliot's fingers hovered over the screen. He glanced at Lena one last time. Then he typed 2 words. Do it. And just like that, the last piece of his old life fell away. The next morning, Elliot sat in his office, staring out at the skyline. A few hours from now, everything would come crashing down for Holloway. The leaked files. The stolen money. The proof of everything he had done. Graham wouldn't survive it. And neither would Lena. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Tristan stepped inside, holding a thick file. You sure about this? Tristan asked quietly. Elliot exhaled slowly. No. Tristan blinked in surprise. Elliot ran a hand through his hair. I don't know if I'll ever be sure. Tristan hesitated, then set the file down. You don't have to do this. Elliot looked up, really looked at him. Yes, I do. Because no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much he wanted to believe in the love they once had, the truth remained. Lena had chosen to betray him. And now, she would live with the consequences. That evening, Elliot arrived home to find Lena sitting at the dining table, a candle flickering between them. She smiled as he walked in. I made dinner. He sat down across from her, watching her closely. Lena reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. I love you. Elliot swallowed. Once, he would have said it back without hesitation. But now? Now, he only smiled. Because the truth was, he wasn't sure if she had ever meant it. And soon, none of it would matter anymore. The office was too quiet. Too sterile. Elliot rubbed his temples, feeling the dull throb of a headache settle behind his eyes. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, untouched beside a stack of reports he hadn't bothered to read. Tristan walked in without knocking. You look like hell. Elliot let out a dry chuckle. That obvious? For years, he had built his career on certainty, on numbers, on calculations, on the kind of logic that turned blueprints into towering skyscrapers. There was a rhythm to it, a predictable formula that never failed him. But tonight, as he sat across from Lena at the dining table, watching her sip her wine with the same easy grace she always had, he felt something foreign stir in his chest. Hesitation. Not because he didn't want justice. Not because he didn't want to see Graham Holloway fall. But because part of him, some quiet, buried part, still wanted to believe in her. And that was the cruelest trick of all. Lena set her glass down, tilting her head slightly as she studied him. You're quiet tonight. Elliot forced a small smile. Long day. She hummed softly, swirling the wine in her glass. You've been having a lot of those lately. It was a test. She was watching him carefully, waiting for him to slip. She didn't know that he had already seen everything. The bank records. The wire transfers. The plans she had made with Graham, built on stolen trust and stolen money. But she knew something was different. Elliot leaned back in his chair, stretching his fingers against the table. I guess I've just had a lot on my mind. Lena reached for his hand, covering it with hers. It was warm, familiar, and for a split second, his body reacted the way it always had, to the touch of the woman he had loved. He wondered if it was instinct or if it was muscle memory. Maybe we should go somewhere, she murmured. Just the two of us. No work, no stress. Just us. It should have sounded like an invitation. Instead, it felt like a trap. Elliot smiled. Maybe we should. Lena's expression softened, and for the briefest moment, Something flickered in her eyes. Was it guilt? Did she ever feel it? Did she ever lay awake at night, thinking about what she had done, about the man she had betrayed? Or had she convinced herself that he deserved it? Elliot wanted to ask. He wanted to press his hands against her face, hold her still, look her in the eyes, and demand to know the truth. Did you ever love me? Or was I just convenient? But he didn't, because the answer didn't matter anymore. The next morning, Elliot stood at his office window, staring at the skyline. In just a few hours, Holloway developments would be finished. Celeste had done her job. Tristan had made sure the leaks were untraceable. And Natalie Sterling, Graham Holloway's wife, had wasted no time taking the information Elliot had given her straight to the board. By now, the investors had seen the files. The stolen money. The offshore accounts. And Lena was in the middle of it all. Tristan stepped into the office, shutting the door behind him. It's done. Elliot turned. How bad is it? Tristan exhaled. Graham's trying to spin it, but it won't hold. His investors are pulling out. His CFO is resigning. The SEC is opening an investigation. Elliot nodded, his fingers tightening around the edge of his desk. And Lena? Tristan hesitated. Her name's all over the documents. She's tied to everything. Elliot's chest ached. He had known this moment was coming. He had prepared for it, planned for it, wanted it. So why did it feel like a goddamn funeral? Tristan studied him. You okay? Elliot exhaled slowly. I don't know. It was the most honest thing he had said in weeks. Tristan nodded, running a hand through his hair. Look, man, I know this isn't just about business for you, but you didn't do this to her. She did it to herself. Elliot swallowed. He wanted to believe that. Maybe someday he would. That evening, Elliot drove home knowing what was waiting for him. He stepped through the front door, and there she was. Lena, sitting on the couch, her phone in her hand, her face pale. She looked up the second he walked in, and for the first time in years, she looked like a stranger. You knew, she whispered. Elliot set his keys down. Knew what? Her breath hitched. Don't do that. Don't act like you don't know what's happening. He took a step forward. Then say it. Lena's throat bobbed. Her hands clenched into fists on her lap. Everything's falling apart, she whispered. Graham's ruined. They're coming after me next. Elliot just stood there, watching her. He should have felt triumphant. He should have wanted this moment, should have relished it. But all he felt was tired. Lena's voice cracked. Elliot, please. Please. For what? For him to save her? For him to forgive her? For him to pretend, just one last time, that she was still the woman he had once built a life with? Elliot ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Tell me the truth, he said. Just once. Lena's eyes filled with something unreadable. Elliot. Did you ever love me? The words cut through the air like a blade. Lena froze. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. And that? That was his answer. Elliot nodded once, swallowing hard. Then he turned, walking past her, up the stairs, shutting the door to their bedroom behind him. And for the first time in his life, he let himself grieve. Lena was gone in the morning. Her suitcase was missing, her closet half empty. Elliot stood in the doorway of their bedroom, staring at the space she had left behind. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like silence. Tristan called later that day. She left town. Elliot nodded, though Tristan couldn't see him. I know. She'll be fine, Tristan said. She always lands on her feet. Elliot wasn't sure if that was a comfort or a curse. But one thing was certain. For the first time in years, he was free. And that? That was a beginning, not an ending. Elliot stood at the kitchen counter, watching the coffee drip into his mug. One drop at a time. Slow. Monotonous. A process he had done every morning for years. But today, it felt different. Because today, he was making coffee for one. The house was silent. Too silent. It was the first thing he noticed. For years, he had grown used to the small sounds of the morning. Lena moving around the house. The sound of her coffee cup clinking against the counter. The quiet hum of her voice when she thought no one was listening. But today, there was nothing. Just the stillness of an empty home. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, his body heavy with exhaustion. He had expected to feel relief, maybe even satisfaction. Instead, he felt tired. Not in the way a long day drained him, but in a way that settled deep, pressing into his bones. Because no matter how much he had wanted this, no matter how much he had planned for it, there was still a part of him that felt like he had lost something. Not Lena. He had lost her a long time ago. But he had lost himself too, somewhere along the way. And now, he wasn't sure who was left. Elliot moved through the morning on autopilot. Shower. Coffee. Answer emails. Ignore the ones from reporters looking for a statement on Holloway's collapse. By noon, he was sitting at his desk at Sinclair and Vaughn, staring at the city skyline, feeling like a ghost in his own life. Tristan knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. So, Elliot looked over at him. So, Tristan crossed his arms. Lena's gone. Graham's career is dead. And you? What now? Elliot exhaled slowly. I don't know. Tristan studied him for a long moment before pulling out a chair and sitting down. You did what you had to do, man. Elliot ran a hand down his face. Yeah, but had he? Or had he just done what was left after everything had already burned? Tristan hesitated, then said, You don't look like a man who just won. Elliot let out a breathy laugh. What does a man who won look like? Tristan smirked. Not like someone who hasn't slept in days. Elliot didn't respond. Because the truth was, he wasn't sure if he had won. What did winning even mean when everything still felt empty? Tristan sighed. Look, I know you. And I know you're going to sit here, analyzing everything until you drive yourself insane. So let me just say this. You're not the bad guy, Elliot. Elliot's fingers tightened around his coffee mug. Then why does it feel like I am? Tristan leaned forward. Because you cared. And people who care always get hurt the most. Elliot swallowed against the lump in his throat. That was the problem, wasn't it? He still cared. Even now, after everything. Even after hearing her voice on that call, after seeing the evidence, after watching her walk away, he still cared. And maybe that was the worst betrayal of all. The day passed in a blur. Elliot barely registered the meetings, the voices, the people who congratulated him for outmaneuvering Holloway. By the time he got home, the house still felt wrong. It wasn't just the emptiness, it was the weight of what had been left behind. Lena's perfume still lingered in the bedroom. Her book was still on the nightstand. A single wine glass sat in the sink, untouched. He should have thrown it all away. But instead, he just stood there, staring at it, feeling the ghost of a life that no longer existed. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Elliot had thought that once she was gone, he would finally be free. But now he wasn't sure if he knew what freedom was. A week passed. Then another. Lena didn't call, didn't text, didn't come back. Elliot told himself it was good, that it meant he could move on, that she had accepted it was over. But at night, when the house was too quiet, he wondered if she ever thought about him, if she ever regretted it, if, somewhere deep down, there was still a part of her that had loved him. But he would never know. And maybe that was for the best. Elliot found himself at a bar on a Wednesday night, a half-finished drink in front of him, his mind somewhere else. He hadn't planned to be here, but he hadn't wanted to be anywhere else either. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. You look like someone who just lost a war. Elliot turned to see Valeria Cross, one of his architects, sliding onto the barstool beside him. He arched an eyebrow. What are you doing here? She smirked. Celebrating. Horizon Tower is back on track. Investors are happy. Boss is, well, not happy but breathing. Elliot exhaled a small laugh. That obvious? Valeria shrugged. A little. She studied him for a moment before saying, You did the right thing, you know. Elliot swirled the drink in his glass. That's what everyone keeps saying. Valeria tilted her head. But you don't believe it. He hesitated. Then, finally, he said, I don't know what I believe anymore. Valeria was quiet for a moment, then said, I had a fiancé once. Elliot looked over at her in surprise. Yeah, she nodded, playing with the rim of her glass. I thought we were going to spend the rest of our lives together. Turns out, I was just a placeholder until he found someone better. Elliot's chest tightened. Valeria exhaled, giving him a small, knowing smile. It gets easier. Not all at once. Not in the way you want it to. But one day, you wake up, and it doesn't hurt as much. Elliot looked down at his drink. And until then? Valeria smirked. You drink. He laughed softly. Well, at least that's simple. She clinked her glass against his. For tonight, that's enough. And for the first time in a long time, Elliot allowed himself to believe it. Elliot woke up the next morning feeling not better, but lighter. The pain was still there. The memories were still sharp. But maybe, just maybe, Tristan and Valeria were right. Maybe he wasn't the bad guy. Maybe he had just loved someone who couldn't love him back. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough of a reason to let go. So he did, bit by bit, one day at a time. Because in the end, the past would always be there. But the future? The future was still his to build. The city stretched out before him, glittering beneath the night sky. Elliot leaned against the railing of his balcony, the wind tugging at his shirt. He had built half of these skyscrapers, designed their foundations, planned their structure down to the last detail. But some things, some people, weren't built to last. But life wasn't architecture. Some things collapsed no matter how well they were designed. And some things were never meant to stand in the first place. It had been a month since Lena left. 30 days without her voice in the house. Without the scent of her perfume lingering in the bedroom. Without the weight of her presence pressing against him in ways he hadn't even realized before. Some mornings, he still reached for her. Some nights, he still thought he heard her footsteps in the hallway. But the difference was, now he knew she wasn't coming back. And for the first time, that didn't feel like a loss. Elliot walked into the office earlier than usual, the familiar hum of the city settling around him. The headlines had moved on from Holloway's downfall. Investors were rebuilding, Sinclair and Vaughn was stronger than ever, and for the first time in weeks, the world felt quiet. Not empty, just quiet. Tristan leaned against his office door, coffee in hand. "You look less miserable." Elliot smirked. "Don't get sentimental on me." Tristan chuckled, stepping inside. "You good?" Elliot considered the question. He thought about Lena, about the way she had smiled at him that last night, not realizing the world she had built was about to crumble. He thought about the anger, the grief, the weight of everything that had nearly broken him. Then he exhaled. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." Tristan nodded, sipping his coffee. "Took you long enough." Elliot smirked. "Shut up." Tristan grinned. "Glad to have you back, man." And this time, Elliot didn't just hear the words. He felt them. That evening, Elliot sat on his balcony, watching the skyline shift into night. The city stretched out before him, full of things he had yet to build, full of things that hadn't been destroyed. He didn't need closure. He didn't need to know why Lena had done what she did. Because some things don't need answers. Some things just need to be left behind. So he let her go. Not with anger. Not with regret. But with the quiet understanding that he had survived. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For now. For today. For the man he was still becoming.